Hello, everyone. My name is Mai Sato, and I'm the inaugural director and currently fellow of Eleos Justice at the Faculty of Law at Monash University. First, I'd like to recognize the various traditional lands on which we meet today. I acknowledge the elders past and present. So welcome to our event on food experiences on death row, the right to food and the right to life. So this project came about when one of our panelists, Maitreyi, was a visiting academic with us. She's a well-known expert on the death penalty in India, and she was having coffee with Leah, who is also on the panel. And I think at that point, Leah had just completed her PhD on the right to food. And I wasn't there at this coffee, but I think another Eleos staff was there who had suggested, oh, why not do a project on the food experiences of individuals facing the death penalty, which brings together both Maitreyi and Leah's expertise. And this wasn't what Maitreyi had originally intended to work on during her academic visit, but I just wanted to share this story first with you as an example of the sort of wonderful coincidental projects that can happen where we are physically working in the same place. Today's event is an online event, but that has the advantage of people from different parts of the world zooming in. But I hope we can still have an interesting dialogue today. So when we were planning for this event, we knew we had a death penalty expert, Maitreyi, and we also knew we had the right to food expert, Leah. But we thought we really need someone who is an expert on food in prison. So we were delighted when Leslie, who is the expert on food in prison, agreed to participate to this event. So thank you, Leslie, for joining us today. So what I want to do now is to sort of read out a very short bio for each panelist before we start our discussion. So Leslie Soble is the Senior Program Manager of Food in Prison Project for Impact Justice. Impact Justice is a non-profit innovation and research center based in the United States aimed at fostering a more humane and restorative justice system. Leslie oversees Impact Justice's initiatives at the intersection of food and incarceration. She has spent over 5 years immersed in research on the carceral eating experience and its impact on individuals, community, and the environment. She's also the lead author of Impact Justice's national report, Eating Behind Bars, Ending the Hidden Punishment of Food in Prison. I'm just going to share Leslie's bio and also the link to the brilliant report that Leslie had led in the chat. Our second panelist, Maitreyi Misra, is founding member and current director of mental health and criminal justice, as well as death penalty mitigation programs of Project 39A. Project 39A is a criminal justice program at the National Law University, Delhi in India. Maitreyi has spearheaded research projects on the death penalty in India and is the lead author of Project 39A's report, Death Worthy, a Mental Health Perspective on the Death Penalty. Maitreyi also led the drafting of the World Psychiatric Association's position statement on mental health and the death penalty. And I think this statement and the award came when you were visiting us, so it was very nice to be able to celebrate that moment. I'm going to share Maitreyi's bio as well as her report on Death Worthy in the chat. And our final panelist is Dr. Leavides Domingo-Cabarrubias, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Eleos Justice at the Faculty of Law at Monash University. She obtained her PhD at Monash in 2023, and her thesis focused on the application of the right to food in the work of international financial institutions. And Leah is also the recipient of the prestigious Molly Holman Award for Best Doctoral Thesis in the faculty. And I'm just about to share Leah's bio and also the work of her PhD thesis. So that's our panelists today. And in terms of the structure of today's event, I will be asking a series of questions to each panelist. But for the three panelists, if I address a question, for example, to Leah, and if you, Maitreyi and Leslie, if you want to, chime in, please feel free to do that. And for the audience participating, there'll be a time, probably around 15 minutes or so at the end to take questions. Just to let you know that your microphones have been switched off. So what you need to do is to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And when you click on that Q&A button, you'll be able to post your questions. Please feel free to post your questions anytime during the panel discussion, and we'll do our best to answer those questions at the end. So again, welcome to our panelists, and I want to start by asking perhaps a not very scholarly question, and I want to address this to Leslie because I'm thinking that this might be on everyone's mind. So when we talk about, food in relation to the death penalty, we typically focus in this idea of, the last meal before execution. As a, expert on food in prison, like what are your thoughts about this mindset and our sort of public obsession with this idea?
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to hear that obsession is international. It's definitely very much an obsession here in the United States, this concept of the last meal. And if you Google, last meal, death row, you'll come up with countless news articles and social media posts, and those things are sort of dissecting what did people request, whether they received those items, whether they ended up eating that food. And this one topic, as you mentioned, probably gets more attention and more fuss around it than anything else related to this food. And, in my perspective, this really contrasts with the silence and the apathy around the bigger issues that relate to food in carceral facilities. So first, it makes this idea of prison food and honestly, even the death penalty itself into a bit of a circus. When folks are on the internet and they're debating whether people are deserving of having a last meal that involves things like steak or lobster, or, people are requesting 21 different flavors of ice cream, it really takes that attention away from the gravity of the situation, from the fact that there is a human being who, whether they're innocent or guilty of their crime, is going to be killed by the state. And second, there are nearly 2 million people in the United States alone who are incarcerated, who need to eat around 3 meals a day, just like the rest of us on the outside. And in the US, at least, there are only about 2,000 people on death row, which is about 0.001%. And we're talking about one single meal for each of those people who is ended up preparing for execution. What we need to do is really stop this focus on this idea of this one meal, which looking at it in this way that makes a spectacle out of prison food, out of the death penalty, and really refocus the conversation around the real issue of prison food, which is that it's regularly causing very serious harm to those millions of people who are incarcerated, including all of those people who are on death row. And it's just disappointing often that in general, people don't seem to be as interested in talking about the larger issues.
Thank you, Leslie. I really like your sort of idea of looking at the last meal versus sort of every 3 meals a day that many prisoners in the US will are given. And I think that perspective really puts the issue, in perspective. Maitreyi, just a follow-up question. Is this idea of a last meal, is that common in India as well?
Not really. While in the few executions that have happened in my living memory, which is like, I suppose I count that as the period from around the 2000s, because before that there were no executions in India in the 1990s. There were late 1990s. The idea of a last meal was very much there. For one of the last executions that happened in India in 2015, which was of a person accused of a terror offense. But that was also closely connected with the fact that the day he got executed was the day of his birthday. So it was a messy public spectacle, and yeah. But the idea of a last meal is not so predominant in Indian consciousness. I would say, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And Leslie, going back to you, and we want to find out more about, the findings of the report. So, your report on food in prison. And by the way, I love the title of your report, Hidden Punishment of Food in Prison. So what are the key issues that prisoners face in relation to food? Could you give us a sort of a brief overview?
Yeah, absolutely. So in general, at least in the US, prison food tends to be very opposite of the diet that we're all told we should be eating. So it's very high in sodium and sugar and ultra processed food. It's very low in fresh fruits and vegetables, quality protein, whole grains. It's basically everything that a nutrition professional would advise you against. And this obviously leads to higher rates of chronic diet-related disease like heart disease, hypertension, diabetes. The meals are also really lacking in essential micronutrients, which can have a serious impact on mental health, including increasing risk of things like depression, anxiety, impaired decision-making, and even violent behavior. Which means that when more people who are incarcerated are experiencing those things, it actually makes prisons even less safe for both people who are incarcerated and for staff. And what's more, we know that there's a physiological connection between food and substance use. And we know that many people who are incarcerated, especially in this country, struggle with substance use. And the typical prison diet actually exacerbates those cravings and perpetuates cravings rather than interrupting them for those harmful substances, rather than supporting the body and healing. Going to another point, prison food is really unappealing, right? We hear all of these stories. It's the butt of the jokes. When there's bad food in an elementary school, people talk about it. The kids all joke, oh, it's like prison food, right? But the problem is that that food is really unsafe. In general, it's very poorly prepared. We've heard so many stories about people finding cockroaches or pieces of metal in their food, moldy bread, sour milk, rotten meat, things that come marked years past their expiration date, or things that arrive in the prison in boxes marked not for human consumption. And so many people find this food too disgusting to eat, so they go hungry while they're incarcerated. We've heard from people who are eating food out of the trash that officers have thrown away. We've heard stories of people who are so hungry and so desperate that they start eating toilet paper and toothpaste just so that they can have something in their stomach. And these kinds of impacts can have really lasting impacts, which is that hidden punishment we're talking about, right? Like when people are sentenced to a prison term, you're sentenced to 3 years. You're not sentenced to 3 years in lifelong diabetes. And those impacts that people have on their physical and mental health can ripple out to their families when they come home and they're in worse shape than they went in, to communities that have to then care for those people who are coming out in worse shape, and to our society as a whole, really. So, looking at it from like a very zoomed out perspective, bad food in prison actually makes us all less safe. And then the last point that I'd really like to make is that I come to this work as a folklorist and ethnographer. That's my academic training. I specialize in food and culture with a particular focus on the way that we communicate through food. And so, I want to ask you all to think about the ways that you communicate through food in your own life, right? Like you bring soup to a loved one who is sick, or you bake a celebratory cake for birthdays, or when you're celebrating something, or you make a hot meal for a friend who is grieving. And in these ways, we use food to say things like, I love you, or I care about you, or I'm sorry. And the food that's served in prisons, on the other hand, is really designed to send the opposite message, that the people who are eating that food are not worthy of care, that they're not worthy of well-being. And we need to remember that these, not just are human beings, but they're people's parents, they're people's children, siblings, partners, best friends, and telling them through food, sending that message that they're not fully human, that they don't matter. The impact of hearing that through the food that's served day after day, for many people year after year, or even for decades, can really have a profound impact on someone's self-worth.
Leslie, I loved your answer on my question. Like, I've never really thought of prison food as sort of, using your words unsafe, and actually in some cases making prisoners, sick or sicker, and also having a negative impact for those who are dependent on, substance. And I also loved how you sort of described, what food means to us. And that really reminded me of Graham Sykes' work about how he talked about, prisoners, how they appreciate the standard of living living, not based on like essentials, but non-essential goods and services. And I think in terms of food, it's not really about just getting the enough calories, because food is so much more about taste, enjoyment, and it's often a social occasion, isn't it? So I feel like prisoners, when there so many activities are restricted inside prisons, like things you still have access to, like food, becomes like, a very important thing. And, that combined with that food, being harmful to you, I think that's like really important for us to understand. So now I want to move on to Leah and Maitreyi to focus more about, individuals on death row and food experiences. And like in death penalty scholarship, we tend to look at the death penalty from the angle of, the right to life or torture. We don't really, focus on food. When we talk about conditions on death row, we often talk about solitary confinement, but rarely, do we focus on food. So maybe we start with Leah and then Maitreyi. Like Leah, do you want to tell us about like, why do you think it's important to put a spotlight on food experiences for individuals facing the death penalty?
Yeah, so thank you, Mike. So following on what you said, that most of the death penalty scholarship and the conversations focus on solitary confinement, for example, because there have been over the past years, there have been concerns raised by human rights organizations, scholars, even United Nations entities on the dehumanizing conditions that people under the sentence of death are subjected to. And most of these are focused on these conditions, solitary confinement, unsanitary conditions, lack of medical care. But there's been no attempt to interrogate the situation, the food situation of death row prisoners. And this, we think, is a significant gap, considering that food is, of course, a basic necessity and is critical to our daily human experience. It is, in fact, an integral part of the everyday experience of prisoners, the daily prison experience. And as Leslie has already mentioned, food is not just in terms of quantity or quality, but the way we experience food as human beings have a positive relationship with food. Unlike animals, we do not consume just so we can satisfy our biological needs. So we prepare food, we choose what we eat, we choose whom we eat with. So these experiences are already automatically denied the prisoners, which is why, as you said, this is included as one of the pains of imprisonment. So one of all the deprivations that the prisoners suffer, one of the most basic deprivation is food inadequacy and food deprivation. But more than that, Maitreyi and I's study have also shown that food can also be a source of dehumanization by itself. So, and this is most pronounced in cases of death row prisoners, because at the moment that the sentence of death is imposed, it already carries the conception that these are not humans. These are objects to be discarded by the state. And this colors the food, the way that these people experience incarceration, including their food experience. So this is just, the food experience is just a manifestation of how the state can strip an individual of their humanity. And this is not only a contrary, in direct contravention to the essence of human rights, but also a violation of the right to food, which we will expound later on.
Thanks, Leah. So, Maitreyi, I want to turn to you, and it would be great if you could talk about, why this topic is important, but, focusing specifically on India. Could you tell us also a little bit about the condition on death row in India, and also if you could speak more specifically about the food experience in India as well?
So I'd like to start with so a couple of points actually, but I'd like to start with the idea of prisons in Indian cultural imagination and its relationship with food, right? So two things. One is that there is a predominant narrative in India about how poorer people go into prison, which is true across the world, and so at least they get two meals a day, right? And when you talk about prisons and who gets incarcerated in India, that does inevitably it makes into the conversation that, oh, at least they're getting two meals a day, and so perhaps um, sometimes people want to enter prison because they have roof over their head and access to meals. So I think there's a bit of a relationship between poverty levels generally and how prisons are seen and the function. People culturally or mainstream culture assumes that they play vis-a-vis basic essentials of life. The other thing is that you also don't want to when I say you, I really mean like the general public and state and things like that. You don't want to portray a picture that a person, for instance, and really in India, when we talk about incarceration and questions of prison or death row, uh, we focus on people who have committed the most heinous of offenses. And if we start talking about things like food and that the quality of food should be good, or that food should have meaning, um, I think in culturally and in the context that we are currently in India, it would take on a very how do I call it? Controversial meaning. Food is then not a basic essential. It becomes a how can you even talk about standards of food in prison for people who have committed the kind of offenses that they have? Right? It becomes part of punishment. And like Leslie was referring to, and her project, hidden punishment. It's not hidden. Sometimes it's very much open and wanted. Uh, And really, death row prisoners in India enter public imagination, enter public conversations from multiple, multiple sort of disadvantages. One is the fact that they have been accused of and convicted of very serious offenses. Those would be mostly either murder or rape and murder, or murder accompanied with sexual violence or terror offenses. Offenses that intuitively, the way we are culturally, it would uh, invoke very abhorrent feelings, very negative feelings. Second is that people who do get the death penalty come from very marginalized communities. They'd be poor, they'd be socioeconomically marginalized, and so when you on top, so the vulnerabilities that they face are multiple. One is the vulnerability that they come with when they enter prison. The other is the vulnerabilities that they then face when they are in prison by virtue of the offense that they've been charged with, by virtue of the death sentence itself. And so, really, to even engage in a conversation about food or that basic essentials should be of a certain quality. Forget the fact that the dehumanizing experience of being sentenced to death makes them more vulnerable, and therefore the state may need to actually actively add more to what their obligations are for the rest of the population. Um, Conversations around minimum quality would really not be appreciated even as a prison manual. So India has a model prison manual which came into fruition in 2016, and we have very particular standards of food, including for death row prisoners. Uh, but the moment you start agitating that, and I'll narrate a story of a prisoner later on, but the moment you start agitating that, it will be seen, or it will almost appear as, why are we doing this for the worst of the worst people? That narrative is there throughout, but it's not a conversation that we look at in India as relevant, also given the general poverty levels, right? General people in the free community don't have access to food. And so talking about food in prisons becomes even more frowned down upon. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Maitreyi. I think it's great to have like different experts from different regions because, you mentioned the really important aspect of, poverty in the wider society, not just in like outside of prison. And that, of course, has a understanding of, what is the adequate in the type of an amount of food to be given to prisoners or death row prisoners. But in your just a follow-up question, in your Deathworthy report, I know the main focus there was prisoners' mental health, but I also know that you've carried out extended, interviews with individuals facing the death penalty. Did the conversation around food ever come up in that sort of, dialogue with the prisoners? I'd love to know how they, spoke about food or, not talked about food. Yeah, we'd love to find out about
So really quickly, the when we conducted interviews for Deathworthy, we did food was not the main aspect. Obviously, it was mental health and the impact of that sentence, etc. But once it was suggested to Leah and me that we might want to consider looking at food and death row, I did go back to the transcripts and I looked through how people had responded, because it does become part of their regular schedule, because lunch is served at this time, dinner is served at this time. So anyway, conversations do come up. And very, there were common ways in which people were describing food in prison, and there were not so common, but and I think I refer to what Leslie was saying, our cultural association with food, those things came up, right? Like, so of course people were talking about how bad the quality of food was. They were talking about the fact that they don't it doesn't fill them up, the quality is bad, they don't get enough food, they don't get enough good quality food, but they were also talking about food as a freedom of, as an expression of freedom. So I remember one of the prisoners that I was interviewing. He, by the way, just mentioned, and food becomes then also an expression of dehumanization in prison. So we were having an interview, and he was sitting across the table from us, and the prison authorities, they gave the interviewers tea and some snacks. And we offered it to the prisoner. And he said that he's not going to have it for two reasons. One, that he's only going to have it once he can choose who he eats this food with. Not that he had a problem with us, but that he'd like to eat this food like samosa. I don't know if it's like a popular snack in India. And that was what, yeah, that is what was served. And he said, no, I can't, I'm not going to eat it now. I'm going to eat it once I get out and I can choose when I eat, what I eat. So that's one thing. The other was in a similar vein, but not as an expression of freedom, but as an expression of how in India, there's this whole thing, cultural meme about Indian mums being like really pushy with food, eat more, eat more, eat more. So this person, he looks at the interviewer, and he's like, you seem to have lost a lot of weight. Why are you not eating well? And you can eat. You're outside the prison. I can't. But there's no reason for you to be losing weight. There's reason for me to be losing weight, sure. But so it's also an expression of humanity. Uh, it's an expression of humanity for the prisoners. It's an expression of freedom. It's a reminder of the fact that they are death row prisoners and therefore they will be served the worst food. It's an expression of uh, a, of childhood, really. One prisoner, for instance, told us how his family got biscuits for him, and he said they get. So this is a prisoner who's in their mid 40s, right? And he's like, they get food meant for children, and it's biscuits and like things that you might enjoy as non-essential items. But really complicated relationship with food, I think, is what has emerged from, uh, by the way, conversations about food. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Maitreyi. I've got a different set of questions about the right to food framework, but before we go on to the sort of the new topic, Leslie, would you like to sort of respond to any of Maitreyi's points, or Leah, do you have anything to add? If not, we can move on to the next questions. But yeah, please, if you have anything to add on to share.
Maitreyi, it's so interesting to hear you say that people are hesitant to talk about people who are imprisoned being worthy of good food, and that they bring up the idea of people are hungry outside. Like, why are we giving good food to people who are incarcerated? We have exactly the same argument here as well. I get that a lot in the work that I do, where people will say, well, we have school children who don't have enough to eat. We have families who are on the outside, they're not the people who are locked up. And I think, the 2 points that I always come back to are, one, we don't have, we're very lucky. We don't have a shortage of food. By serving decent and nourishing food to people who are incarcerated, you're not actually taking that food away from the school children. Everyone actually deserves access to good food, and we should make it possible for everyone to be able to have good food. I think the other thing that, that usually comes up when people talk about, that sense of, well, those people deserve good food, those people don't. The line between who actually is incarcerated and who needs good food because they can't afford it on the outside is very thin. The people who are incarcerated are usually coming from those communities in this country too, right? It's generally people who are poor, people who aren't white, people who don't have access to nourishing food in the first place. And oftentimes the only dividing line between someone who's incarcerated and someone who isn't and is on the outside is that the person who's incarcerated has gotten caught in doing whatever it was that they were doing, or that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or their skin was the wrong color, or various things that it's a very permeable line. It's not necessarily a question of deservedness. And so it's really interesting to hear that same argument is echoed. Who are these people to deserve good food? To hear that is something that echoes in other places in the world.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that's a really important point to make. Leah, do you want to add something before we talk about the right to food framework?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a segue later on the question of the serving food, because we are going to discuss that it's not just a matter of the serving, but a matter of right. But also I would add to the discussions by saying that indeed it is difficult to identify what constitutes enough food, what constitutes adequate food, quality food. And I think that in matters like this, it as suggested by the European prison rules, it would be the state that would identify, I would identify a minimum quality and quantity of food that would be enough for the prisoners.
Thank you. I think that sort of, the idea of what is adequate food, what's the international standard or the minimum standard, I think is a nice segue into what we'd like to talk next, which is about the sort of the framework of the right to food. So As I said earlier, from a death penalty scholarship perspective, we often treat the death penalty from the perspective of the right to life or torture, and they belong in a civil political rights category, and right to food within the economic, social, cultural rights category. We don't often overlap. Scholars, specializing in civil political rights often don't, engage with, economic, social, cultural rights. So I think this project, looking at both the right to life as well as the right to food, I think is really important. But I think we should have a more detailed discussion on the usefulness, appropriateness, and perhaps also the limitation of using the right to life, right to food framework in examining and understanding and critiquing food in prisons and food for individuals facing the death penalty. So this question is open to all panelists, but I want to know, what are your thoughts on using the right to food as the framework of analyzing and understanding or critiquing food in prisons? I don't know who should start. I mean, Leah, you're the right to food, currently recovering from COVID, so I'm just concentrating is very difficult for me, so apologies. So Leah, you are the right to food expert. So do you want to talk about, how it applies, the importance of the framework and its utilities?
Yes, let me just say first that, of course, as we might all know, it is a fundamental tenet under international human rights law that people experiencing any form of detention do not lose any of their human rights, except, of course, the right to liberty. And it is also according, for example, to the minimum treatment requirement guidelines for the minimum treatment of prisoners. The persons in detention enjoy the full range of civil and political rights, and the substantive social and economic rights as enshrined, for example, under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And one of the most fundamental human rights under the ICES, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, is the right to food. Well, of course, for people who are state parties to these covenants. But to frame the issue of food of prisoners and prisoners under the sentence of death would mean that these people are entitled to good, to quality, adequate food, because it is their right. I mean, it is not just because we are good people and we want to give them good quality food. So it is their basic entitlement, it is their right, and it is the obligation of the state to provide this food in a manner that respects their humanity and their dignity, for example. So this might be, this might be a simple statement, that a given, for example, but it would go a long way in changing, for example, the mindset of people that they can demand. It is a demandable right for prisoners, and it can be a basis of holding states accountable for these obligations. And not like ignoring these problems is in itself a breach of international human rights law. So perhaps if there is any questions later, I can expand on what are the elements of the right to food. But just to say now that, of course, the right to food is not like a one size fits all, or just applicable to everyone, because for example, the requirements for the realization of the right to food is different according to based on different contexts. Like, for example, in my thesis, I explained that the women experience hunger differently from men because of deep-seated inequalities affecting their access to food. And in the same way, the free community, the general population, have different requirements for the realization of the right to food as compared to people in detention. So I guess Maitreyi can expand on how exactly the right to food can be applied in the context of the death row, and Leslie can expand on how this can be applied in the concept of prison in general.
Thanks, Leah, for explaining the sort of the right to food framework and also sort of contextualizing that. So I want to move on to Leslie and Maitreyi. Leslie, perhaps you could go first and talk to us about the, your thoughts on the right to food framework when analyzing food in prisons, and then move over to Maitreyi.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it in the sense of the right to food as relates to sort of international human rights law. In the United States, we actually don't have one single prison system, one single carceral system. We have many. We have a federal Bureau of Prisons, which is overseen at the federal government level. We have 50 states, which each have their own individual prison system. And we have county jails and city jails, which are local facilities, which are all under their own jurisdiction. And there aren't any national standards in terms of right to food or anything like national standards for food safety or nutrition guidelines that apply to all of those different systems, apply to all the prisons and jails in the country. And it's just, I think it's very, very useful to think about it in that context of international human rights law, right? This right to food is something that everyone is supposed to be able, everyone is supposed to be able to have that right to food. And yet, in the same time, we have all of these different structures and different systems with different kinds of policies, and so many of them are ignoring that international right that everyone is supposed to have.
Thanks, Leslie, for that insight, because it just reminded me of a guest lecturer I had from the US to speak about US death penalty, and he was saying that when he teaches that topic, students rarely sort of raise the issue of human rights. They might talk about inhumane treatment or it's not right for the state to kill, but rarely use the language of human rights. So yeah, it just reminded me when you spoke about the idea of rights. When you're talking about food in prisons and the different systems and different standards you have within the country. Maitreyi, do you want to add?
I think just a really quick point. I think I more than just not just, but more than focusing on the right, I think it's useful to focus on the fact that if the state is incarcerating people and then uh, there are people in the state's custody and closely monitored and all of that. What obligations does the state have to ensure that there is a basic minimum standard being met? That people are continuing, because in India, for instance, there's great rhetoric and jurisprudence about the idea of dignity and the right to life, and how we don't lose any of our other rights just because we're incarcerated, and etc. etc. But the fact is that once you are in the custody of state in terms of incarceration, what obligations does the state carry, and what obligations does the state have to discharge to really ensure that those basic requirements of the right to life are being met? And I think that might be useful into the conversation, because in India, for instance, like I previously mentioned, the model prison manual has very food is regulated. You have calorific values, you have nutrition, you have micronutrients, and how many milligrams and grams they must be for each meal. One, that's not being done. That's clear from not just the research that I conducted, but on death row prisoners, but in prisons in general. That quality of food is really poor. But I think more than the right, it is for us to discuss about, and for us to really highlight the fact that the state has a responsibility to make sure that people who are in custody, and I think for people who are under the specter of death, there are heightened vulnerabilities. How do we ensure that those vulnerabilities don't get exacerbated, and that uh, the the idea of uh, living a, I'm going to just call it humanized living and not a dehumanized life, is discharged. And it's really upon the state that we should focus on what should their responsibility be to ensure that people are not getting the worst quality of food. Uh, Food is being respected both culturally and as a basic minimum requirement of daily sustenance. Rather than what's the content of the right, I think maybe what's the content of the obligation.
Thanks, Maitreyi. I think it's important to think about state obligations whenever we talk about rights. Leah, given this is your expertise, the right to food, would you like to sort of respond to the points made by Leslie and Maitreyi before I sort of pose everyone my last question before we go into the Q&A?
Yeah, I think as it is now, the right to food is a bit vague without actually clarifying the how in practice it can apply to different groups of people, and in this case, prisoners. So when we say the right to food, it has, for example, specific elements like adequacy. It has to be adequate. It has to be available in the market. It has to be good quality and quantity. But these ones are not the only relevant ones to assess whether the right to food is being realized. So in the context of prison, for example, because prisoners do not have the autonomy to choose which food to eat, or which is adequate and which is quality. Our research with Maitreyi was looking at how the manner in which the food is prepared and served, or the food experience itself has to be dignity affirming, or it has the state has the obligation to prevent the food experience to be a dehumanizing or a degrading experience. And the bottom line for that would be the basic human rights thought view that these human beings deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. So I think what I'm saying is, in terms of the right to food as applied to death row prisoners, the basic elements need to be complemented with the principle of dignity, upon which the international human rights law is based. So
Thanks, Leah, for that. I think I'm going to move on to my last question, which is about, I think, Leslie, your work is very innovative. I think in the sense that, even in the US, not much attention is paid to food in prison. And, so you really put a spotlight on that. And then we know so little when it comes to, death penalty, individuals facing the death penalty. So I think this topic is really important. I'm so pleased that, we can do this event. But, I'm just thinking, based on the current status, what are the next steps that we can do as researchers and as civil societies to improve food conditions, and also, the realization of the right to food. So I'd love to hear from all of you, whoever would like to go first.
So if I can just quickly say a couple of things. Really, I think as researchers, we need to sort of focus on food in terms of not just how in the Indian context it'll be in terms of adequacy, or like what Leah was saying, the three triple AQs of adequacy, quantity, is it nutritious, but really what to talk about the fact that there is people who are incarcerated, people who are on death row are people first, and they've had a relationship with food that they bring into the prison. Prison is not a while it cuts you off from the rest of society, it doesn't cut you off from yourself as a person. And to honor that, and to highlight the fact that the idea that somehow, oh, at least they're getting two rotis per meal, or whatever the cultural expression of that in India might be. Um, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is people being able to, as a culturally important facet of our lives, people being able to relate to food as not just a manner of sustenance, but as a manner of protecting themselves from the harsh realities of death. It's not, we look to food when we want comfort. We look to food when we are celebrating things. We look to food when we are mourning. Food has a very, very important cultural significance, and to just strip that away, and put it as it's important for sustenance. No, it's important for living, and I'm not even going to the level of well-being. It's just important for me to be able to, for a person to be able to live, and not just survive in what our jurisprudence on prison and dignity has called it, not just live an animal existence. And I think to highlight that, and the role that food plays in helping not live an animal existence.
Thanks, Maitreyi. Leslie or Leah, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, one of the reasons why we also embarked on this research and this webinar is just to put visibility on this issue. And I know that this webinar left more questions perhaps than were answers. I think this is already a good start in putting a spotlight to this issue. So we are hoping that there will be more research, and there will be more conversations with this similar subject matter, and that this will just be a good start to better policies by the governments, more conversations, and perhaps even recommendations from United Nations entities or resolutions from the United Nations. So yeah, we are hoping that this is just a start.
Thank you, Leah. Leslie?
Yes, I agree with you, Leah. I think that, raising awareness and making sure that people care is the first step. Change isn't going to happen unless enough people care to make that change happen. Policies get put in place because people decide they should be there, and we need people who decide that everyone, including people who are incarcerated, including people who are under the sentence of death, have the right to food. We need to make sure that people who are under sentence of death also have the same rights as everyone else who are incarcerated. I think one of the statistics that we use a lot in our work here is that 95% of the people who are incarcerated in the US will eventually return to their communities. In general, the people who are on death row are not part of that, they're the 5% who might not be returning to their communities, but it doesn't make their lives any less human or any less, worthy of those human rights. And I think, like you mentioned, Leah, policy needs to be in place. We need to have those policies. We also need to have oversight to ensure that there isn't a gap between the policy that's set and what's actually happening in carceral facilities on the ground. There's a huge policy versus practice gap that we have here, and it sounds like that might be something that's happening in other places, like in India, like you were talking about. And I think, the last thing is that we need to think outside the box and recognize that we don't have to accept that prison food is this way. One of the things that we're doing at our organization right now is trying different kinds of solutions. We're working with local farmers in the state of California to bring fresh produce inside the prisons for people who are incarcerated, as well as support small local farmers that are in the areas that are, in many cases directly surrounding the prisons. Across the country on the East Coast, we're working with a company called Brigade that usually puts professional chefs into schools to retrain school kitchen staff to prepare food that kids want to eat, that meets nutrition guidelines, that stays under budget, but actually tastes good. And we are working with them. We currently have a chef in residence of a state prison system in the state of Maine. to try and figure out like what happens if you put a professional chef in to run food service operations and teach people who are incarcerated, how to prepare food that actually tastes good. What does that do in terms of health benefits for physical health, mental health, people's general well-being inside a prison? So I think just not accepting the way that things are and making sure that we're staying focused on actual change is something that could potentially help as well.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I think that these are very important points regarding how we sort of conduct advocacy and thinking outside the box. I'm going to move on to questions. We have a couple of questions. I think the first two questions, which I'm going to ask together to Leslie, is so what's the impact of reduction in daily food intake? So I think this is talking about volume. How does that impact the health of prisoners? And then the second question is, what kind of food is served to pregnant prisoners?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the reduction of daily food, right? I mean, how many of us get what we call it hangry, to experience hunger? You get hungry and angry at the same time when you don't have enough food, right? So on the physical side, you might be losing weight, which has impacts for things like dehydration and the way that your body is functioning. But also it really impacts your mental health to just be hungry all the time, which makes people, again, subject to things like violent behavior or impaired decision making. And if we're talking about in the US, at least, prisons are often framed as sites for rehabilitation, for helping people get back in better shape to be able to return to society. Having people who are hungry, that doesn't actually help those goals. And in terms of what kind of food is served to incarcerated women who are pregnant, again, in the US at least, that sort of varies depending on the jurisdiction, because again, we don't have national standards. In most places, there are policies that women who are pregnant should get extra food, but oftentimes that's something as simple as like a small bag with a little bit of extra milk and some, crackers with peanut butter or something on them. I know a woman who was pregnant while she was incarcerated, and she lost 40 pounds while she was pregnant because she wasn't getting enough food, and the food that was available was too disgusting to eat. So yes, there are lawsuits happening in this country right now, specifically around women who are incarcerated getting enough to eat, but it is definitely an issue.
Thank you, Leslie. Maitreyi, I don't know if you have data on this, but do you know about the food given to women prisoners who are pregnant?
So there's a specific category, what we call as medical diet. So pregnant women will get a medical diet, but in whether it's in theory or in practice is something to be investigated. While we have it on the books, whether it's actually being implemented in the way in which it's meant to be is a question I'd let researchers answer empirically rather than just in theory.
Brilliant, thank you. And maybe I'll combine two questions to Leah. There's a question on the right to life, how the right to life is sort of, right to food, how right to food is sort of understood in accordance with like religious and cultural requirements like halal meat, kosher meat, vegetarian food. So that's one question. And the other is, what did you find most interesting part of the research, of this project?
Yeah, I think that actually is an issue that is the answer is interlinked, because the one thing that I learned from this exercise, including my thesis and the food in prison, is we cannot just apply the right to food, the human rights universally. So we have to consider the specific situation, a context of vulnerabilities, or even religious needs of people in analyzing whether human rights are being realized. So that is why I was arguing in my thesis that substantive equality needs to be integrated in these human rights norms. So what I am saying is to really apply a human rights norm, we have to take into consideration and recognize and address the specific vulnerabilities, religious needs, specific contexts of groups of people. So yeah, I think that would answer both the questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leah. I'm conscious of the time, so I need to sort of wrap this up, but I want to say thank you so much for the three panelists for joining today. And thank you so much. It's been a really exciting and interesting discussion, and I'm very pleased that this will be it's been recorded and it will be uploaded on our Eleos's website